For 4 weeks, the most powerful man in Beijing sat alone in a corner booth of a Montana cafe, and not a single person spoke to him. Raymond J. Hill could buy the entire town with a phone call, but he couldn't buy what he desperately needed: connection. The locals whispered about the foreign billionaire in the expensive suit, convinced he was there to steal their livelihoods, to gentrify their quiet mountain town into something unrecognizable. They were wrong about everything. What they didn't know was that Raymond wasn't there to take anything. He was there to find something he'd lost forever. The last place his son smiled before he died. And it would take just 2 words, spoken in Mandarin by a young black waitress named Brenda P. Gibbon, to shatter 4 weeks of silence and reveal a truth that would change an entire community. This is a story about grief, prejudice, and the universal language of kindness that transcends every border we build between us. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been misunderstood, this story will remind you why sometimes the smallest acts of recognition can save a life. Welcome to Whispers of Fate Stories, where we share true tales of human connection that remind us who we really are beneath the surface. Today's story comes from Cedar Falls, Montana, a town of barely 3,000 souls nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. It's about a father who traveled 6,000 miles to sit in silence, a community that built walls out of fear, and one woman who understood that sometimes speaking someone's language means more than just knowing the words. Before we begin, if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss these moments that restore our faith in humanity. Now let's step into that small-town cafe where Raymond J. Hill sat alone, waiting for anyone to see him. The bell above the door of the Cedar Falls Cafe chimed at exactly 7 o'clock every morning, and the man in the corner booth would look up with the same desperate hope in his eyes, searching for something the locals couldn't understand. Raymond J. Hill didn't belong here. That much was obvious to everyone who saw him slide into the worn red leather booth by the window, his tailored charcoal suit and Italian leather shoes a stark contrast to the flannel shirts and work boots that filled the rest of the cafe. The smell of bacon grease and fresh coffee hung thick in the air, mixing with the low murmur of farmers and construction workers discussing weather patterns and weekend plans. But around Raymond's booth, there was only silence. Betty, the 60-something waitress with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, would approach his table with her order pad, her smile vanishing the moment she got close. "Coffee," she'd say flatly, not a question but a statement. She'd pour the black coffee without meeting his eyes, set down 2 pieces of toast he never touched, and walk away before he could speak. Raymond would leave a $20 bill under his cup every morning, a 400% tip for a $3 breakfast, but Betty never thanked him. She'd pocket the money with pursed lips, as if accepting payment from a dangerous animal. The whispers started the moment Raymond walked through the door each morning. "That's him," someone would mutter. "The Chinese developer. Heard he's from Beijing. Probably here to buy up Main Street." Another voice would chime in. "My cousin in Bozeman said investors like him are buying everything, turning small towns into tourist traps, pushing out the locals." The conversations would spiral, each person adding their own fear to the narrative. "He's been here 4 weeks now, just sitting, watching, probably calculating how much he can get for the hardware store, the post office, this place." Gregory K. Birch, an elderly man who'd lived in Cedar Falls for 78 years, would shake his head over his scrambled eggs. "Used to be you knew everyone in this town. Now we got strangers coming in, changing everything. My daddy built half these buildings with his own hands. I'll be damned if I let some foreigner tear them down for condos." The others would nod in agreement, their collective anxiety building with each passing day. Raymond heard it all, every word. His English was perfect. He'd gone to Stanford for his MBA, had negotiated billion-dollar deals in boardrooms from New York to London, but he never corrected them. He never defended himself. He just sat in his corner booth, staring out the window at the mountains beyond, his coffee growing cold, his toast untouched. What the townspeople couldn't see was the phone in his lap, the screen displaying a photo of a young man with kind eyes and an artist's hands. Gerald H. Hills, his son, the only person who'd ever mattered more than his empire. The phone buzzed constantly with calls from Beijing, from Shanghai, from his business partners whose messages grew more frantic with each ignored ring. Raymond, the board is demanding answers. We're losing the Shanghai deal. You need to come back. Now. But Raymond would silence each call with a swipe of his thumb, his jaw tightening. None of it mattered anymore. The empire he'd spent 30 years building felt like sand slipping through his fingers, meaningless and cold. Because 4 weeks ago, just 30 meters outside this town, his son's car had collided with a semi-truck on Highway 89. Gerald had been driving back to Bozeman after his car broke down in Cedar Falls. And in the last voice message Raymond ever received from his son, a message he'd listened to 500 times, maybe more, Gerald's voice had been filled with a joy Raymond hadn't heard in years. "Baba," Gerald had said in Mandarin, his words rushing together with excitement. "You wouldn't believe how nice people are here. My car died right on Main Street, and this whole town came out to help me. The mechanic stayed late to fix it. The lady at the cafe gave me free lunch. Someone even invited me to dinner at their house. They treated me like family, Baba. Like I mattered. This is what the world should be like."
Raymond had been in a meeting when that message came through. He'd listened to it once, typed back a quick reply. "Good. Don't be late to your internship Monday. We'll discuss your future when you return." And gone back to his conference call about a hotel development in Macau. He never got to have that discussion. By Monday, Gerald was gone, and Raymond was left holding a phone full of ignored messages and a heart full of regrets so heavy he could barely breathe. So he came to Cedar Falls searching for the last place his son had felt happy. The last place Gerald had felt seen. And now, for weeks later, Raymond sat invisible in the very cafe where his son had been welcomed, surrounded by the very people who'd shown Gerald kindness, and not one of them knew who he was or why he'd stayed. The irony was almost unbearable. His son had found love here. Raymond had found only suspicion and silence. And as the morning sun streamed through the window, casting long shadows across his untouched breakfast, Raymond wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake coming here at all. The accident report sat folded in Raymond's jacket pocket, the edges worn soft from being touched too many times. Montana Highway Patrol. Case number 2024 to 1847. Time of incident, 11:47 p.m. Location, Highway 89, 0.3 miles east of Cedar Falls. Vehicle 1, 2019 Honda Accord, driver Gerald H. Hills, age 24. Vehicle 2, semi-truck, driver not at fault. A cause, failure to maintain lane, possible fatigue. Raymond had read those words so many times they'd become a prayer, a punishment, a penance he recited in his mind whenever the guilt became too much to bear. But the police report didn't tell the real story. It didn't capture the phone call that came at 2:37 a.m. Beijing time, the detective's carefully neutral voice saying, "Mr. Hill, I'm calling about your son." It didn't describe the sound Raymond made when he understood what those words meant, a noise that came from somewhere deeper than his lungs, somewhere primal and broken. It didn't mention how Raymond's wife, May, collapsed in the hallway when he told her, or how their apartment in Beijing's most exclusive tower suddenly felt like a mausoleum filled with all the wrong kinds of silence. What haunted Raymond most wasn't the accident itself. It was the timeline. Gerald's car had broken down in Cedar Falls at 4:30 p.m. The mechanic, a man named Jack Patterson, according to the receipt Raymond had found among Gerald's belongings, had kept his shop open 2 hours past closing to fix an alternator. The cafe had given Gerald lunch and dinner, 2 meals, both comped, according to the credit card statement that showed no charges. Someone named Alfredo had invited Gerald to a barbecue. Another person had drawn him a map to the scenic overlook, telling him it was the most beautiful sunset spot in Montana. Gerald had spent nearly 7 hours in Cedar Falls, and according to that last voice message, they'd been the happiest 7 hours of his recent life. Then he'd gotten in his car, driven 12 minutes down Highway 89, and died when he drifted into the oncoming lane. The coroner said he'd likely fallen asleep at the wheel, exhausted from the stress of the breakdown and the long drive. But Raymond knew the real reason Gerald had been on that road at all. He'd been driving back to Bozeman for an internship at Raymond's real estate firm, an internship Gerald had never wanted, at a company whose values had never matched his soul. "I want to study art, Baba," Gerald had said 6 months earlier, standing in Raymond's home office in Beijing, his portfolio tucked under his arm. "I want to go to Rhode Island School of Design. I got accepted." Raymond had barely looked up from his computer screen. "Art doesn't build empires, Gerald. Art doesn't feed families. You have a responsibility to this company, to our name. You'll finish your business degree, and you'll learn real estate. This discussion is over." And Gerald, gentle Gerald who'd never raised his voice to his father in his entire life, had simply nodded and put his portfolio away. 2 months later, he was dead, and Raymond would give every building, every dollar, every meaningless achievement to take those words back. He'd trade his entire empire for 5 more minutes with his son. For the chance to say, "I was wrong. Study art. Be happy. That's all that matters." But time doesn't bargain, and death doesn't negotiate, so instead Raymond sat in a Montana cafe, trying to understand what Gerald had felt in his last happy moments. Trying to find the warmth his son had described, the kindness that had made Gerald's voice crack with emotion on that final message. "They treated me like family, Baba. Like I mattered." Raymond played the message again now, his phone hidden beneath the table, earbuds tucked discreetly in his ears. Gerald's voice filled his head, young and alive and full of wonder. "You wouldn't believe how nice people are here." Raymond looked around the cafe at the people who'd shown his son such kindness, the same people who now avoided his eyes and whispered about him with suspicion. Did they remember the young Chinese man who'd needed help 4 weeks ago? Did they know that their generosity had given a dying man his last moment of pure joy? The bell above the door chimed, and Betty hurried past Raymond's booth to greet the new customer, a construction worker with paint-stained jeans. "Morning, Alfredo." Betty called out, her voice warm and welcoming. "Your usual spot's open. Kevin's got your breakfast started." Alfredo H. Pierce, the foreman from Pierce Construction, waved and headed to a booth near the counter, chatting easily, with the cook visible through the kitchen window. Raymond's heart clenched. Alfredo. The same name from Gerald's voice message. "Someone named Alfredo invited me to a barbecue, said I should stay the weekend, meet his family." This was one of them. One of the people who'd made Gerald feel like he belonged. And now Alfredo sat 15 feet away, laughing with the cook, completely unaware that the foreign stranger in the corner was the father of the boy he'd been kind to. The boy who died trying to get back to a life he'd never wanted, all because his father had been too proud and too practical to let him follow his dreams. Raymond's phone buzzed again. Another call from Beijing. His business partner, Chen Wei, probably calling to inform him that another deal had collapsed, that the board was considering removing him as CEO, that his absence was destroying everything he'd built. Raymond declined the call. Let it all collapse. Let the empire crumble. What had it ever given him except money and status, and the crushing regret of realizing too late that he'd sacrificed his son's happiness for buildings that would outlast them both? A tear slid down Raymond's cheek, and he wiped it away quickly, glancing around to see if anyone had noticed. But of course, no one was looking. No one ever looked. He was a ghost in this place, invisible despite sitting in plain sight. And maybe that was what he deserved. Maybe this was his punishment, to be surrounded by the people who'd loved his son, who'd given Gerald what Raymond never could, and to be completely alone among them. The coffee in his cup had gone cold again. The toast sat untouched as always. Outside the window, the mountains stood eternal and indifferent, their peaks dusted with early snow. And Raymond J. Hill, one of the most powerful men in Asia, sat in his corner booth and grieved for everything he'd lost and everything he never had the wisdom to appreciate until it was gone. For weeks in this town, and he was no closer to finding what Gerald had found. He was just a stranger, sitting in silence, waiting for something he couldn't name. Waiting for someone to see him the way this town had seen his son. What Raymond didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that someone finally had. If this story is touching your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Sometimes we all need a reminder that we're not as invisible as we feel. The silence around Raymond J. Hill wasn't just an absence of sound. It was active, deliberate, a weapon wielded with precision by people who'd perfected the art of the cold shoulder. Small towns have their own language, and in Cedar Falls, that language spoke volumes through averted eyes, tight-lipped nods, and conversations that died the moment Raymond approached. He'd learned this language over 4 weeks of trying and failing to bridge the chasm between himself and the community. On day 5, Raymond had attempted to speak to Gregory K. Birch, the elderly man who sat 3 booths away every morning reading the Great Falls Tribune. Gregory had been alone, which seemed like an opportunity. Raymond had walked over, his heart pounding with an anxiety he hadn't felt since his first business presentation decades ago. "Excuse me," he'd said, his English careful and precise. "I wonder if I might ask you about the area. I'm interested in local history." Gregory had looked up slowly, his weathered face hardening. He'd folded his newspaper deliberately, stood up, dropped a $5 bill on the table, and walked out without saying a single word. Betty had watched the entire exchange from behind the counter, her expression saying everything. "You're not welcome here." On day 9, Raymond had tried a different approach. He'd arrived at the cafe early, before the morning rush, hoping to speak with Kevin Marshall, the cook whose laugh he could hear from the kitchen. Raymond had walked up to the counter, cleared his throat, and said, "The food here is excellent. I was wondering about the recipe for." Kevin had turned around, spatula in hand, and the friendly expression he'd been wearing vanished like smoke. "We're busy," Kevin had said flatly, turning back to the grill. "Can't talk." But the grill had been empty, the morning rush still 30 minutes away, and both men knew it. The rejection had been so naked, so absolute, that Raymond had simply walked back to his booth and sat down, his face burning with humiliation. By day 12, Raymond had stopped trying to initiate conversations. He'd learned to read the signals, the way people would rearrange their seating to avoid sitting near him, the way mothers would pull their children closer when he walked past, the way the volume of conversations would drop when he entered and rise again when he retreated to his corner. He'd become a pariah, a threat, a villain in a story he'd never agreed to star in. The irony was almost funny. In Beijing, Raymond commanded rooms full of executives with a glance. His phone calls could move markets. His decisions affected thousands of jobs, millions of dollars, entire neighborhoods. But here, in a cafe that probably grossed less in a year than he spent on his car, he couldn't even get someone to make eye contact. Power, he was learning, was contextual. Strip away the office, the reputation, the cultural framework that gave his authority meaning, and he was just a foreign man in an expensive suit, as powerless as a beggar on the street. What hurt most was knowing that these same people, these exact same people, had welcomed Gerald with open arms. His son, who'd been just as Chinese, just as foreign, had found love here in hours. But Gerald had been young, unthreatening, broken down and vulnerable in a way that invited help rather than suspicion. Gerald had needed something they could give. Raymond, by contrast, appeared to need nothing at all, and that prosperity made him dangerous in their eyes. They looked at his suit and saw gentrification. They looked at his silence and saw calculation. They looked at his persistence in returning day after day and saw an enemy planning his attack. If only they knew. If only Raymond could find the words to explain that he wasn't here to take anything, that he'd gladly give them everything he owned if it meant understanding what Gerald had felt in this place. But the wall of silence had grown so thick that even attempting to speak felt like shouting into the void. So Raymond stopped shouting. He stopped trying. He simply existed in his corner booth, a ghost among the living, waiting for something he couldn't articulate. His phone buzzed constantly now, multiple times per hour. His business partners had moved from concern to panic to anger. The messages piled up, unread. Raymond, the board has called an emergency meeting. They're discussing a replacement. The Shanghai deal is dead. We've lost $200 million because you won't sign the contracts. Your wife is worried sick. She says you won't return her calls. At least let her know you're alive. That last message made Raymond pause.
May.
His wife of 28 years, grieving alone in Beijing while he sat in a Montana cafe chasing ghosts. He should call her. He should go home. He should be there to share the crushing weight of their loss. But every time he thought about leaving Cedar Falls, about boarding a plane back to Beijing, panic seized his chest. Gerald's last happy moments had been here. If Raymond left, he'd lose even that tenuous connection. He'd be abandoning the last place his son had felt joy. So he stayed. And the calls kept coming. And the silence kept growing. And the people of Cedar Falls kept whispering their theories about the foreign billionaire who wouldn't leave, who just sat and watched and waited for the right moment to strike. On day 17, Raymond had overheard a conversation between Betty and Alfredo that made his blood run cold. "My cousin the lawyer in Helena," Alfredo had said, his voice low but not low enough, "says these foreign investment companies have been buying up properties all over Montana. They come in quiet, stay for a few weeks to scout, then make offers people can't refuse. 6 months later, the whole town's changed. Local businesses shut down. Rents triple. Working people get pushed out." Betty had shaken her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Not here. Not in Cedar Falls. We need to organize. Get ahead of this. Make it clear we're not selling." Raymond had wanted to stand up and shout, "I'm not here to buy your town. I'm here because my son died." But the words had stuck in his throat, trapped behind the wall of language and culture and grief that made communication feel impossible. How do you explain to people who've already decided you're the villain that you're actually the victim? How do you make them see you as human when they've already cast you as a monster? So Raymond had said nothing. He'd finished his cold coffee, left his $20 bill, and walked out into the Montana sunshine that felt too bright, too cheerful for the darkness pooling in his chest. And the next morning he'd come back. Because where else did he have to go? What else did he have to live for? At least here, in this cafe that hated him, he was close to something Gerald had loved. At least here, he could sit where his son might have sat and imagine, for brief moments, what it felt like to belong. For weeks, 28 days, 672 hours of silence. Raymond had become an expert in loneliness, a scholar of isolation, a professor of what it meant to be invisible. He'd learned that rejection didn't get easier with practice. Each day felt as sharp as the first, each cold shoulder as brutal, each conversation that died in his presence as devastating as the last. And yet he stayed. Because leaving would mean accepting that he'd never understand what Gerald had found here. Leaving would mean returning to an empire that had cost him everything that mattered. Leaving would mean admitting that he'd failed as a father, failed as a man, failed to learn the only lesson that mattered. That connection matters more than conquest, that being seen matters more than being successful, that love matters more than power. So Raymond J. Hill sat in his corner booth on the morning of day 28, his coffee growing cold as always, his toast untouched as always, surrounded by people who'd loved his son but couldn't see past their fear long enough to recognize his grief. And he waited, though he didn't know what he was waiting for. A sign. A miracle. Someone, anyone. To break the silence and remind him that he was still human, still worthy of basic kindness, still deserving of the dignity his son had found so easily in this place. What Raymond didn't know was that his miracle was about to clock in for the afternoon shift. Brenda P. Gibbon had lost her father when she was 16 years old, and the loss had taught her to recognize grief in all its disguises. Cancer had taken Ronald Gibbon slowly, methodically, stealing pieces of him until the man in the hospital bed bore little resemblance to the father who taught her to ride a bike and read to her every night before bed. Brenda had learned during those final months that grief doesn't always look like crying. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like a man showing up every day to a place where no one wants him, as if the act of returning itself could fill the void inside him. She'd noticed Raymond J. Hill on her first afternoon shift, 3 weeks into his silent vigil. Brenda worked afternoons and evenings at the cafe, fitting the job around her online classes in international relations. She'd graduated from the University of Montana 2 years ago with a degree in Asian Studies and a minor in Mandarin Chinese, a degree her small-town friends had called useless, but that Brenda had pursued out of genuine fascination with a culture so different from her own. Cedar Falls didn't have much use for Mandarin speakers, but Brenda had never regretted the late nights studying characters, the summer she'd spent in Beijing as an exchange student, or the way learning another language had opened her mind to how differently people could see the world. So when she'd first spotted Raymond in his corner booth, she'd noticed things the other staff members had missed. The way his hands shook slightly when he lifted his coffee cup. The way his eyes tracked to the door every time the bell chimed, as if hoping someone specific might walk through. The way he touched his phone constantly, but never seemed to actually use it for anything productive. These weren't the behaviors of a calculating investor scouting properties. These were the behaviors of someone drowning in plain sight. "Who's the guy in the corner?" Brenda had asked Betty during her second shift, nodding toward Raymond's booth. Betty had rolled her eyes. "Some Chinese billionaire. Been here for weeks. Won't talk to anyone, just sits there staring. People think he's here to buy up the town." Brenda had frowned. "Has he actually said that? That he wants to buy anything?" Betty had paused, her certainty wavering. "Well, no. But why else would he be here? And why stay so long? It's suspicious." Suspicious. That word seemed to justify everything. The cold shoulders, the averted eyes, the way people spoke about Raymond as if he weren't sitting 15 feet away. Brenda had watched the dynamic for a few days, her discomfort growing. She'd seen this before, this small-town suspicion of outsiders, but usually it faded once people had a chance to talk, to find common ground. Raymond never got that chance. The community had decided who he was before he'd said a single word. On her fourth shift, Brenda had done what she always did when she needed answers. She'd researched. During her break, she'd pulled out her phone and typed "Chinese billionaire Montana" into Google. The first result had stopped her heart. "Son of Beijing real estate mogul dies in Montana car crash." The article was 3 weeks old, published in the Bozeman Daily Chronicle. Gerald H. Hills, 24, son of prominent Beijing developer Raymond J. Hill, was killed in a single-vehicle accident on Highway 89 near Cedar Falls. According to police reports, Hills had been traveling from Cedar Falls to Bozeman when his vehicle crossed the center line. The cause of the accident remains under investigation. Brenda had read the article 3 times, her coffee going cold in her hands. Gerald H. Hills. She'd looked at the accompanying photo, a young man with gentle eyes and an easy smile, wearing a paint-stained shirt and holding a paintbrush. The caption read, "Gerald Hills was a talented artist and recent graduate of Beijing International Studies University." Then Brenda had scrolled through her memory of 3 weeks ago, back before Raymond had started coming to the cafe. She'd been working that day, the day Gerald's car had broken down on Main Street. She remembered it now, a young Chinese man, maybe mid-20s, standing next to a smoking Honda Accord, looking lost and overwhelmed. Jack Patterson had towed the car to his shop. Betty had insisted Gerald come to the cafe for lunch on the house. Alfredo Pierce had invited him to a barbecue that weekend. Kevin Marshall had spent an hour talking to him about art, showing him the sketches Kevin's daughter had done. Gregory Birch had given Gerald a tour of the town, pointing out buildings that were over 100 years old. The town had loved Gerald. They'd welcomed him with the kind of open-hearted hospitality that made small towns special. And less than 12 hours after leaving Cedar Falls, Gerald was dead. And his father had come here, to the last place his son had been happy, and the same community that had loved Gerald had shut Raymond out completely. The realization had hit Brenda like a physical blow. This man wasn't here to gentrify anything. He was here to grieve. And everyone in the cafe, people who considered themselves good, decent Christian folk, had spent 3 weeks treating a grieving father like a threat because he looked different, because he had money, because they'd invented a story about him without bothering to ask if it was true. Brenda had walked back into the cafe that day with new eyes. She'd watched Raymond sit in his corner booth, his untouched toast and cold coffee, the way he stared out the window at nothing. She'd seen the slight tremor in his hands, the tightness around his eyes, the way he seemed to be holding himself together through sheer force of will. And she'd recognized every sign. This was how her mother had looked in the months after Dad died. This was the face of someone trying to survive 1 minute at a time, someone for whom getting through the day felt like climbing a mountain. Over the next week, Brenda had paid closer attention. She'd noticed that Raymond always arrived around the time Gerald would have been here, late afternoon, after the lunch rush. She noticed that Raymond sat in the booth nearest the window that overlooked Main Street, probably the same spot where someone might have watched a broken-down car getting towed. She'd noticed that Raymond left absurdly large tips, not to show off but almost apologetically, as if trying to earn the basic human decency everyone else received for free. And she'd noticed the phone calls he ignored. The way his phone would buzz and buzz, the screen lighting up with names in Chinese characters, and Raymond would just stare at it before declining the call. Brenda had done the same thing after her father died. People kept calling, relatives, friends, her dad's colleagues, everyone wanting to express their sympathy, to help somehow. But talking to them had made it more real, had forced her to say the words, "My dad is dead," over and over until they felt like sandpaper on her tongue. So she'd stopped answering. She'd let the calls go to voicemail. She'd hidden in her room and pretended the world didn't exist, because engaging with it meant acknowledging a truth too painful to bear. Raymond was doing the same thing, hiding in plain sight, sitting in a cafe full of people, utterly alone with his grief. And no one saw it. No one asked. No one offered the basic compassion that every human being deserves in their darkest moment. On day 27 of Raymond's vigil, Brenda had made a decision. She'd walked up to Betty during the afternoon lull and said, "I'm going to talk to him." The man in the corner. Betty had looked alarmed. "Why would you do that? He doesn't want to talk. That's why he sits there all quiet." Brenda had shaken her head. "Betty, he doesn't talk because no one will listen. There's a difference." Betty had frowned, her defenses rising. "Brenda, you don't understand. Men like that, she'd struggled for the right word. "They're not like us. They have their own agenda." Brenda had felt her temper rising, but she'd kept her voice calm. "Men like what, Betty? Grieving fathers? People in pain? Because that's all I see when I look at him." The conversation had ended uncomfortably, with Betty muttering about youth and naivety and not understanding how the world works. But Brenda didn't care. She'd spent 4 years studying a culture that valued respect, hospitality, and dignity. She'd spent a summer in Beijing learning that beneath the surface differences, people everywhere wanted the same basic things: to be seen, to be heard, to matter to someone. And she'd learned from her father's death that grief is a language everyone speaks, even if the words sound different. So on day 28, Brenda P. Gibbon clocked in for her shift, tied on her apron, and rehearsed the Mandarin phrase she'd been practicing all morning. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her resolve was firm. She was going to break the silence. She was going to see Raymond J. Hill not as a threat or a stranger or a foreign billionaire, but as a father who'd lost his son. As a human being in pain. As someone worthy of the same kindness this town had shown Gerald. And if it made her coworkers uncomfortable, if it went against the unspoken rules of Cedar Falls, if it marked her as different or naive or too educated for her own good, she didn't care. Because somewhere in heaven, Brenda's father had taught her that you stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. That you speak for those who've been silenced. That you extend grace even, especially, when it's not convenient. Brenda took a deep breath, picked up the coffee pot, and walked toward the corner booth where Raymond J. Hill sat alone, waiting for a miracle he'd stopped believing would come. She was about to give him one. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is see someone when everyone else has looked away. Remember, that as we move into the most powerful part of this story. The afternoon sun slanted through the cafe windows, painting Raymond's corner booth in golden light that seemed almost cruel in its beauty. He sat as he'd sat for 28 days, his coffee cold, his toast arranged in an untouched pattern that had become ritual. The cafe was moderately busy. The lunch rush had passed, but a few regulars remained scattered across the booths, lingering over pie and gossip. Raymond had learned to tune out the conversations, the laughter, the easy familiarity that reminded him how foreign he truly was here. Then he heard footsteps approaching. Different from the usual quick pass-by Betty performed every morning. These footsteps slowed, stopped at his table. Raymond looked up, expecting to see Betty's tight-lipped face, ready for another silent coffee refill. Instead, he saw a young black woman, maybe late 20s, holding a coffee pot with both hands. She had kind eyes, he noticed. The first kind eyes he'd seen directed at him in a month. The woman took a breath, as if gathering courage, and then spoke. Jiang Xianqing, Nin Xiang Yao Xinxian de Cafe Ma? Raymond's world stopped. The question hung in the air, impossible and real. Mr. Hill, would you like fresh coffee? Not in English. In Mandarin. Perfect, textbook Mandarin with a slight American accent that made it endearing rather than awkward. Someone in Cedar Falls, Montana spoke his language. Someone had learned his name. Someone had called him Xianqing, Sir, Mr., a term of respect that acknowledged his dignity as a human being. Raymond's throat closed. His eyes filled with tears so suddenly he couldn't stop them. For weeks of holding everything together, of maintaining his composure in the face of rejection, of sitting in silence while his heart shattered piece by piece, it all broke at once, undone by two simple sentences in his native tongue. He tried to speak, tried to respond, but the only sound that came out was a sob. Raw, ugly animal. The sound of a man who'd been holding his breath for a month and could finally exhale. The woman, Brenda, her name tag-read, set down the coffee pot and slid into the booth across from him. She didn't recoil from his tears, didn't look uncomfortable or embarrassed. She just sat, her hands folded on the table, and waited with the patience of someone who understood that grief can't be rushed. Around them, the cafe had gone quiet. Every conversation had stopped mid-sentence. Every head had turned toward the corner booth where the foreign billionaire was crying and the young black waitress sat across from him like they were old friends. Betty stood frozen behind the counter. Around them, the cafe had gone quiet. Every conversation had stopped mid-sentence. Every head had turned toward the corner booth where the foreign billionaire was crying and the young black waitress sat across from him like they were old friends. Betty stood frozen behind the counter, her coffee pot suspended in midair. Alfredo had put down his fork. Kevin had emerged from the kitchen, dish towel in hand. Gregory Birch had removed his reading glasses, staring with open confusion. Brenda reached across the table and gently pushed a napkin toward Raymond. He took it with trembling hands, wiping his eyes, trying to compose himself. But the dam had broken, and weeks of suppressed grief poured out in waves he couldn't control. Do a bookie, Raymond managed to whisper.
I'm sorry.
Buyong Daoqian, Brenda replied softly. You don't need to apologize. Then, switching to English for the benefit of the watching crowd, she said clearly, Mr. Hill, my name is Brenda. I'm so deeply sorry for the loss of your son. The words carried across the silent cafe like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples of shock through every listening ear. Betty's hand flew to her mouth. Alfredo's face went pale. A coffee cup clattered against a saucer somewhere in the room. His son, someone whispered. What happened to his son? Another voice asked. Brenda kept her eyes on Raymond, her voice gentle but firm. Your son Gerald was here 4 weeks ago, wasn't he? When his car broke down. Raymond nodded, unable to speak, tears still streaming down his face. Brenda continued, her voice growing stronger, addressing not just Raymond, but the entire cafe. Gerald's car broke down on Main Street on a Tuesday afternoon. The people of this town helped him, fixed his car, fed him, welcomed him. He called his father that day and said it was one of the happiest days of his life. That night, driving back to Bozeman, Gerald fell asleep at the wheel and died in a car accident on Highway 89. The silence in the cafe transformed from curiosity to horror. Betty had tears in her eyes. Alfredo had buried his face in his hands. Gregory Birch's weathered face had crumpled with recognition and shame. "Oh my God," Betty breathed. The young man with the Honda. The artist. I remember him. He was so sweet, so grateful for everything. Her voice cracked. That was his son? Brenda nodded. Mr. Hill came here searching for the last place his son was happy. He's been sitting in this cafe for 4 weeks, hoping to understand what Gerald felt here, hoping to feel close to him. And we treated him like a criminal. The words landed like physical blows. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Alfredo stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked slowly toward Raymond's booth, his face contorted with emotion. "Mr. Hill," Alfredo said, his voice thick. "I'm the one who invited your son to a barbecue. I talked with him for over an hour about his art, about his dreams. He showed me sketches on his phone, landscapes, portraits, beautiful work. He said..." Alfredo's voice broke. He said his father wanted him to be a businessman, but all he wanted was to create beautiful things. Raymond looked up at Alfredo, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. "He told you that?" "Yes, sir. And I told him that life's too short not to follow your passion. That at the end of the day, it's the things we create and the people we love that matter, not the money we make." Alfredo's hands were shaking. "I had no idea. No idea that hours later, he'd be gone. No idea that you were his father. We thought you were, we assumed." "You assumed I was a threat," Raymond said quietly in English, his accent heavy but clear. "You were protecting your town. I understand." "No." Gregory Birch's voice rang out from across the cafe. The elderly man stood up, leaning heavily on his cane. "There's no excuse for what we did. None. We saw a foreign face, and we made up stories. We saw expensive clothes and assumed the worst. We didn't even give you a chance to speak." He made his way to Raymond's booth, each step deliberate. "Your boy sat in my car for 30 minutes while I drove him around town, showing him the history. He asked such good questions, listened so carefully. Made an old man feel like his stories mattered. I loved that young man in the space of half an hour." Gregory reached the booth and extended his weathered hand. "I am so deeply sorry for your loss, Mr. Hill. And I'm ashamed of how we treated you. Your son deserved better. You deserve better." Raymond stood, his legs unsteady, and took Gregory's hand. The old man pulled him into a fierce hug, and Raymond collapsed into it, sobbing against Gregory's flannel shirt. The dam that had held for 4 weeks, that had survived silence and rejection and crushing loneliness, finally broke completely. Raymond wept like a child, held up by the arms of a stranger who'd become, in that moment, something like a father. Betty approached next, tears streaming down her face. "I gave your son lunch and dinner that day. He insisted on washing dishes to pay for it, even though I told him it was on the house. He was in my kitchen for an hour, helping Kevin prep for dinner service, asking about recipes, talking about food as art." She touched Raymond's arm gently. "He talked about you, Mr. Hill. Said his father was brilliant, successful, that he wanted to make you proud." We could hear the love in his voice, even though we could also hear the struggle. Kevin emerged from the kitchen, his chef's coat stained with the afternoon's work. "Gerald told me he wanted to open a gallery someday. A place where art and community could meet. Where people could see that beauty matters as much as profit." Kevin's voice was rough with emotion. "I've been serving you coffee for 4 weeks, and didn't realize I was serving the father of a young man who changed my whole perspective on what matters in life. I'm so sorry." One by one, the people of Cedar Falls approached Raymond's booth. Each with a memory of Gerald. Each with an apology. Each carrying their own shame at how they'd treated a grieving father. The afternoon shift turned into an impromptu wake, a celebration of a young man whose brief visit had touched an entire community, and a reckoning with their own prejudice and fear. Brenda sat quietly in the booth, watching the transformation unfold. She'd known what would happen once the truth came out. Small-town people, when confronted with their mistakes, Either doubled down or opened their hearts completely. Cedar Falls, to its credit, chose the latter. Raymond, exhausted from weeks of grief held in silence, found himself surrounded by the very people who'd shunned him. They brought stories of Gerald, how he'd admired Jack Patterson's mechanical skills, how he'd sketched the mountains while waiting for his car, how he'd asked everyone about their lives with genuine interest. They painted a picture of Gerald that Raymond had never fully seen, his son as an adult, generous and curious and fully himself in a way he'd never been able to be at home. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the cafe windows, Alfredo cleared his throat. "Mr. Hill, I know this doesn't change anything, doesn't bring Gerald back. But if you're staying in Cedar Falls a while longer, my family would be honored to have you for dinner. Like I invited your son. It's the least we can do." Raymond looked around the cafe at the faces that had been cold strangers just hours ago and were now something else entirely, not quite friends, but no longer enemies. People who'd failed him but were trying, clumsily and sincerely, to make amends. "I would like that very much," Raymond said quietly. 3 months later, Raymond J. Hill stood at the grand opening of the Gerald H. Hill's Memorial Art Gallery on Main Street in Cedar Falls, Montana. The building had once been an abandoned hardware store, one of many Main Street casualties of big-box retail. Now it gleamed with new paint, filled with natural light from skylights Raymond had insisted on installing, its walls covered with Gerald's artwork and pieces from local artists. The town had turned out in full force. Betty and Kevin had catered the event with Gerald's favorite meal, the meatloaf and mashed potatoes he'd eaten on his last day in Cedar Falls. Alfredo's construction company had donated labor to renovate the building. Gregory Birch had commissioned a bronze plaque for the entrance with Gerald's photograph and the words, "Create beauty. Love people. Make the world softer than you found it." Brenda stood beside Raymond as he gave a speech, translating for the handful of business associates who'd flown in from Beijing. Raymond's wife, May, had come too, her first time in America, her first time seeing the place where their son had felt such joy in his final hours. "My son taught me, in death, what I failed to learn from him in life," Raymond said, his English stronger now after months of daily conversation. "That success without connection is empty. That power without compassion is meaningless. That a life measured only in buildings and dollars is a life wasted." He paused, gathering himself. Gerald found in Cedar Falls what I had spent 30 years overlooking, that being truly seen by others, being treated with dignity and kindness, matters more than any achievement. That community is not built on wealth, but on willingness to show up for each other. He gestured around the gallery. "This space is my apology to my son, and my gift to this community that showed him love. It will be free to all, always. A place where artists can create, where beauty can exist for its own sake, where young people can dream without worrying about profit margins." Raymond's voice cracked. "I cannot give my son back his dreams, but I can honor them, and I can make sure other young artists have the support I failed to give Gerald." The applause was thunderous. May wiped tears from her eyes. Brenda squeezed Raymond's hand. And in that moment, standing in a small-town art gallery 6,000 miles from his Beijing office, Raymond J. Hill felt something he hadn't felt since Gerald's death. Purpose. Not the hollow purpose of closing deals and expanding empires, but the deep, bone-level purpose of making meaning from tragedy, of transforming grief into something that honored his son's memory. After the ceremony, as people mingled and examined the artwork, Brenda found Raymond standing in front of Gerald's largest painting, a Montana landscape, mountains and sky, completed just days before his death. "Ta hui gondao jiao da," Brenda said softly in Mandarin. "He would be proud." "Was Shiwang Risi," Raymond replied. "I hope so." Then in English, "Brenda, I never properly thanked you. For seeing me when no one else would. For speaking my language when I'd forgotten how to speak anyone else's. For being brave enough to break the silence." Brenda smiled. "My dad used to say that the world doesn't need more people who are right. It needs more people who are kind. You were grieving, and we were cruel. Someone had to step up. You didn't just speak Mandarin that day. Raymond said thoughtfully. You spoke the language every grieving person needs to hear. I see you. Your pain matters. You're not alone. That transcends any dictionary. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the townspeople admire Gerald's art. Betty was explaining one of the paintings to a group of teenagers. Alfredo was taking photos to post on the town's website. Kevin was discussing with May the possibility of hosting monthly community dinners at the gallery. Gregory Birch sat on a bench, his cane beside him, simply taking it all in with tears streaming down his weathered face. Raymond had stepped down as CEO of his real estate empire. The board had appointed Chinwei as his replacement, and Raymond had moved into an advisory role that required minimal time. He'd bought a small house in Cedar Falls, not the luxury he was accustomed to, but enough. He spent his mornings learning English with Gregory, his afternoons volunteering at the gallery, his evenings walking the same streets Gerald had walked, trying to see the world through his son's artist eyes. The empire he'd built hadn't crumbled without him, which was perhaps the most humbling lesson of all. The buildings still stood. The deals still closed. The money still flowed. His absence had barely registered beyond the boardroom. But here, in this tiny Montana town, his presence mattered. The art gallery mattered. The relationships he was building mattered. The healing, his own and the community's, mattered. May approached them, her English halting but determined. Brenda, Raymond tells me you study international relations, yes? Brenda nodded. Yes, ma'am. Good. We need more people who build bridges between cultures, who see human first before nationality. May's eyes were bright with purpose. I want to start scholarship. The Gerald Hills International Understanding Scholarship. For students who study languages, cultures, who want to bring people together. She looked at Raymond. Gerald would like this, yes? Raymond nodded, his throat tight. Yes. He would like this very much. And so the healing spread outward, ripples in a pond, touching lives far beyond Cedar Falls. The gallery became a destination, written up in Montana travel guides. Artists applied for residencies. Students came on field trips. The town that had nearly missed its chance to honor Gerald's memory became a beacon of what community could be when people chose connection over suspicion, compassion over fear. 1 year after that first conversation in Mandarin, Brenda and Raymond sat in the corner booth of Cedar Falls Cafe, the booth that had once been a prison of silence and had become sacred ground. It was early morning, the cafe filling with regulars who now greeted Raymond by name, who asked about his wife and his work and his life with genuine interest. Betty poured their coffee without being asked, adding, "Your usual?" to both of them. The transformation was complete. Raymond belonged here now. I think about that first day often, Raymond said, stirring sugar into his coffee. How close I came to leaving. I decided that morning, day 28, that I would give it 1 more week and then return to Beijing. Except that I'd never understand what Gerald found here. Go back to the life I knew. What changed your mind? Brenda asked, though she knew the answer. 2 words in Mandarin from a stranger who cared enough to see past the surface. That's all it took. 2 words, and the entire trajectory of my life changed. Raymond smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. You saved my life that day, Brenda. I was drowning, and you threw me a rope made of my native language and basic human decency. Brenda shook her head. You saved yourself. You had the courage to keep showing up even when no one wanted you here. That takes a strength I'm not sure I have. We all have that strength when we need it, Raymond said. Grief teaches us that. It strips away everything except what truly matters, the need to be seen, to be known, to matter to someone. He looked around the cafe, at the community that had learned to see him. Cedar Falls taught me that we're all just people trying to get through the day with some dignity intact. That our differences, language, culture, wealth, skin color, they're real, but they're not as important as what we share. The capacity for both cruelty and kindness, and the choice we make between them every single day. The bell above the door chimed. A family walked in, tourists, by the look of them, nervous and out of place. Raymond watched as Betty approached them with a warm smile, as Alfredo called out a greeting, as the community that had once met strangers with suspicion now extended welcome as naturally as breathing. They learned, Brenda observed quietly. We all learned, Raymond corrected. I learned that grief shared is grief diminished. That isolation is a choice as much as a circumstance. That asking for help, accepting kindness, being vulnerable, these aren't weaknesses. They're the very things that make us human. He raised his coffee cup. To teachers who appear in unexpected forms. Brenda clinked her cup against his. And to students brave enough to learn the lessons. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd found each other across a chasm of language and culture and grief. Outside the window, Main Street bustled with morning activity. The art gallery's lights glowed warm in the early sun. And somewhere, in whatever place exists beyond this one, Gerald H. Hills smiled at his father sitting in a cafe, finally understanding the lesson his son had tried to teach him all along. That we're all just walking each other home. That kindness costs nothing, but means everything. That the language of grief is universal, but so is the language of compassion. That sometimes the greatest gift we can give another human being is simply to see them, really see them, and say in whatever language they understand, you matter. Your pain matters. You're not alone. And in that recognition, in that simple act of witnessing another person's humanity, we find our own. If this story touched you, ask yourself, who in your life is sitting in the corner booth, waiting to be seen? Who have you looked past because they didn't fit your expectations? Who deserves the kindness you've been too busy or too afraid to offer? Raymond J. Hill learned that you can build an empire and still lose everything that matters. Cedar Falls learned that suspicion is easy, but understanding requires courage. Brenda P. Gibbon proved that sometimes 2 words in another language can save a life. The Cedar Falls Cafe still stands on Main Street. The corner booth is still there. And if you ever find yourself traveling through Montana, stop in. Order the meatloaf. Sit for a while. And remember that every stranger you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. The smallest act of kindness can change everything. Thank you so much for staying with me to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you're going to love the next one. It's even wilder and more fascinating than you can imagine. So go ahead and click the subscribe button. Click the image on your screen now to watch the next story.